Welcome, everybody. Got a few more minutes here before we get started. Just want to make sure that you can hear me, that my microphone's working. So today's session, as I introduced, is on trial review. Best practices, tips for taking a trial that you've received from another source and getting a feel for what's inside and making sure the information is the way you would want. Couple of terms I'll just kind of use in general throughout, really being sponsor versus trialist. I'll just kind of refer to those in general. We're kind of imagining maybe we are a sponsor company who has contracted out the research to a trialist, and now we're receiving the trial back from the trialist. Will be probably how I typically will phrase all of these features, but certainly there's a lot of cases that it might not be that scenario, but you still need to review the data. So hopefully that's at least helpful terms I'll just kind of throw out, even if it doesn't always match all of the cases that these features might be handy with. So really the first topic I want to highlight is probably the most powerful from the standpoint of really looking into the file and across all of the different sections of a trial. You know, there's many different sections of the site description. There's a lot of assessment data that can be put in, all of the descriptions of those assessments. You know, there's a lot of information that is put in a trial. And so really our goal is to reduce the amount of time that it would take to look at all of that data. Because of course, if you had to open each and every trial and click through every section of that trial and look with your eyes to see that things are the way you want, that's time consuming. And so trial validation is a tool for really to have ARM do that looking for you. So with the push of a button, we can have ARM look through every section of the trial at a much faster speed and give us a report back about what is missing, what is not quite right, what needs to be looked at. And so that's really probably the biggest engine for trial review is this validation. And so here on the screen, just kind of highlighting what goes on when you run this validation in ARM. And so the first thing it will do is it will refresh any automatic entry fields. So for example, on the assessment editor, when you have a rating date, then ARM can calculate your interval between the rating and the application, or a couple of other different interval fields that just automatically populate. So ARM will refresh those to make sure that they are calculated and accurate when you run that validation. It also performs cross checks. So just some obvious ones. For example, if you have a unit, but you don't have a value, or vice versa, something like your formulation concentration. Okay, well, I put in a unit, I have my formulation unit, but somehow I neglected to put in a number for the concentration. Well, clearly, if I put in a unit, I meant to put in a value. And so that's the type of thing that ARM can find and alert you to say, hey, there's a unit here, but there's no value. What were you doing? Or vice versa. There's a value here, but you didn't put in the unit. There's missing information. There's also some cross checks for dates. So if I mark my trial as completed on today, November 16th, but in the assessment section, I have an assessment that was marked as November 20th. Two things there. Number one, obviously November 20th in the future. So ARM is going to be like, did you take this assessment in the future? That doesn't make sense. But also it'll say relative to your completion date. That doesn't make sense. You can't have an assessment that was performed after the trial was all done. So there's some just kind of logical checking that ARM will do automatically as part of this validation to catch some of those Maybe you just picked the wrong year accidentally, or something like that. It can kind of catch those situations. And then finally, ARM will verify the rules that are in the study. So there's a few of them in your study definition. So that's when you first set up the protocol. What definition did you choose? There are some of the global sponsors have their own customizations, their own definition, and those have various rules that are applied that would get checked. If you're doing the standard GDM def, the G all study definition, there's fewer. There's very few limitations and rules, but there might be a couple in there that get checked. And then finally, you can also have user-defined rules, which would be that study rules editor. And we'll look into utilizing that here in a moment. So just to show that here, I have a trial open. This is actually just an example study in our tutorial list. So you can even open this up on your computer if you want to kind of replicate what we're doing today. But to run the validation, we'll open up the Tools menu. And this little checkbox icon, check mark icon here for Validate Trial, where the keyboard shortcut is Control-A, will perform the validation. And so real briefly, in the corner here, there was some red text and it was starting to walk through the validation process. And as it worked through that process, there is an issue that arose. So here in the site description, the country we have filled in is invalid. And so with this validation, ARM, as soon as it finds an issue, will stop, present to us what the problem is. And if I say okay, it will actually take us right to the field where the problem is occurring. So here, even though we were looking at our assessments, it will take us to the general trial and put the cursor right in the problem field. In this case, certainly Germany is the right country, but I think this is an old code. So certainly I could find Germany in this list. And let me just filter for it, Germany. There, so that's the right code. So this is an old trial that hasn't been touched in a while, so that must be the issue that came up there. But essentially that validation here will run through its list of things to check. And as soon as there's a problem, will bring us right to that issue to allow us to adjust and make our changes. So that can be helpful if you are the trialist, if you are preparing to send this trial to your sponsor or to another person, and you want to make sure that your file is ready. You want to avoid any embarrassments of, oops, I didn't fill that in correctly. This validation with that checkbox is really helpful to step you through. ARM will just kind of walk you through the trial and bring you to the problem for you to fix it. Sometimes, though, if maybe you aren't the trialist, maybe your review, if you're the sponsor, is I'm probably not going to be able to answer some of these issues. I just want to know what are the issues, if any, so that way I can have my trialist or the person who ran this file, the person who sent me this file, they really need to be the ones to fix this. So you can use the same validation, but from the Tools menu, there is an option to log the errors instead. So this is Control-E. So it's really the same validation as far as the steps ARM performs. And you can see it's validating here in the corner. And so now what it will do is it will run through the whole list. And even as it encounters issues, it will just populate the list of problems and give us an overview in the end. So instead of stopping at each issue, it will give us this list. I don't know if it just didn't refresh my country here. I thought I picked a correct one, but at any rate, at least we have an error here. Maybe I'll manufacture a couple other ones if we go to the assessment data perhaps, and I guess not my rating date, but if I had, well, here, we'll use my treatments as an example here, where I said my formulation concentration. If somehow we neglected to fill that in, that would be an example here as well. So you can see we can have multiple errors. So we'll run the validation again. Here now it has multiple issues. We still have that invalid country selected. And now it also discovered that this formulation concentration in treatment line 5 is empty, even though we have a unit. So the nice thing here with this log errors is it will give you kind of that full rundown of what is missing, what is an issue here in this study. And as that example of the sponsor, you can click this clipboard button and create an email. I'll open this just in Word. But you could write an email back to your trialist and say, here, I found these issues with this trial. And here I just pasted in, we click the clipboard, so I just pasted in that information, that whole list from this trial to tell them, hey, the country isn't quite right, and the treatments is, the formulation concentration needs to be looked at as well. So that's a real great quick way to have ARM look across the whole trial, give you a list of issues that you can send back to the trialist or whoever provided you that file to say, hey, this needs to be updated. This isn't quite right. This is missing, whatever the case may be. And kind of related to that, maybe a little less with trial review, but in the same heart of that communication between two different people working on a trial with ARM, is that you really want to maintain one source of truth with your trial files. So again, using the example of a sponsor company contracting out the research, that sponsor can send a protocol or send an empty trial to the researcher who's doing the trial. And as the trialist may provide updates, periodic updates. Here, send me the trial every 2 weeks so we can see the progress of how the trial's going. And you can certainly run this validation at each point. That sponsor can to just take a review of the progress of that trial. But it's very important to keep that source of truth into one file. And that would be really the, not just one file, but the location of the file. Really, that trialist should have the source of truth. So if I discover, for example, that country code is weird, well, if I'm the sponsor and I see that, yes, I could change the file here on my computer that I have open, but that's going to create a different copy because this is on my computer, while that trialist might be already taking another assessment and working on that trial. So as long as that trial is still going on, the trialist should be the only person to make any changes in that trial, because it's going to make a mess. If I try to do something with this file on my computer and then send it back to the trialist, that'll make a mess, because what if they've already made changes in their copy? If I make changes here and then the trialist sends me an update and they never made the changes, then when I open their copy, I'm going to have the same issue again. So it's important to maintain that source of truth with the trialist while that trial is going on. And then once they've submitted that final version, then you can make these changes with the file as long as you have that one file in one spot. So that's my soapbox here for the day about that. But I think it's really important for working with the files, of thinking of not creating duplicate information, not creating multiple versions of a file. You really want one person being in charge of making updates and putting information in a file. And so there's a question here about minimizing the errors when you would open up a trial. I'm not sure if that's kind of talking about these validation errors, trying to minimize those. But really, I would say the validation here is trying to uncover inconsistencies and issues. So in some ways, the errors would be good in that you're going to detect the problems. And that's really the goal here, is what tools can we use to detect issues or inconsistencies in the files. So great question here, if you can do a validation on a batch of trials. So the short answer I would say is no. That this validation does occur kind of just within one trial. So the workflow really would be that you would open one file, run the validation, take any actions, and then open up the second trial and run the validation and continue. So we don't really have a batch validation feature. I would say the only caveat to that is if you do have the ATD, the trial database. That's the one case. If you were to upload a batch of trials to the database, that does perform the validation right before uploading to your company database. And so that would be the one case that you can validate on a batch of files. But kind of this trial, one trial just to look at them, yeah, it is kind of a one-by-one look. And we'll show some tips a little later on too for at least looking across a list of trials to validate them to some extent. Not this validation per se, but we'll see the study list, some features there. So one thing I want to point out here with the validation is really you can customize the validation by creating study rules. And that's really the power of the study rules and the validation, is to add your own study rules to define what matters to you. And one of the reasons there's not a lot of rules in the standard screen is because it's generalized to all sorts of kinds of research. And so we really leave the door open for each company, each user to decide what's important to me. So this is really my first best practice here, would be to create a study rule set. Create a list of rules that matter to you or matter to your company. And the best way to do this would be to open up a trial. If you have one, because you're doing this process right now, that's great. If you had one from last season, try to find the most recent trial that you've worked on, and think about all of the different pain points, all of the, well, I usually have to ask the trialist to fill in this or fill in that, or, you know, there always has some sort of problem with the application equipment, or, you know, what am I always asking about? What am I always having to look at and fix? In any obvious requirements. Okay, every single trial I ever run, that has to have GPS coordinates. It has to have assessment dates when they fill in a date. You know, there's some obvious things that no matter what, it's going to be true. I need to have that information. And so go through one trial and be as thorough as you can to think of all of those different cases and create rules from them. So in our case here, we can open up our trial and just start going through and say, well, what am I always asking for? What do people forget to fill in or don't fill in correctly? Things like that. And let's make a study rule so that way ARM can check it instead of me. So GPS, I have to have GPS. You just right click on the field that you have to have, and you do a required, and then you can set at what point in the trial schedule, the trial status, do they have to have that information. So for GPS, they're going to know that as soon as we establish the trial. So I could set that as established. And they better do both the latitude and the longitude. So I'm going to require that at established. Maybe I would like to have the accuracy, but it's not something everyone has always. I can do recommended, and maybe I'll recommend that they put in the accuracy, but it's not going to be required. You can go through each of these sections. So maybe we'll go down to the crop. What do I need? Maybe in all of my studies, I have to have a variety. So I can mark that as required, and that can be, they'll know that when it's established. You'll notice that in this case, they have it filled in. Really, it doesn't matter whether it's filled in or not in this trial. We're using this trial kind of as the template to build up our list of rules. And then we'll be able to use those rules throughout our other studies. Walk through, application weather. I need to have the velocity, the wind velocity. So let's require that when it's final. But we don't have to have it any sooner than that. And the air temperature, you can go through, put in whatever you need at whatever time of the trial that's necessary. And what's happening here, if we go to the study rules, is that we're building a list of rules as we're doing these right click. So we're requiring these different fields at a certain time. And so you can build up all of this extra validation that's really custom to yourself or to your company, whoever you're really thinking of all of the trials that this would apply to. Once you've done that, once you've made it through the trial and thought of all those different scenarios that you really want to have, then down at the bottom of the study rules, there is a save rule set. And essentially, we're going to take this list of rules and we are going to give it a name so we can apply that to any other trial that we have. So in my case, maybe I want this to be my trial summary rules. Give it a name to kind of remind yourself, what is the purpose of this? And maybe this is general. I can always make another set that's more specific if I wanted. So all of my fungicide trials have a few more things that I'm going to need to require. And then, whatever however you'd want to segment your different types of studies, you can create different lists for different types of studies. And this is going to save just as a file on my local computer. And then there's a description here so I can provide more information to myself, more or less. That'll be embedded in the file. So when I load the set, I can see that information and remind myself. So that's really all that is useful for. So now we've created this list, and in any other trial, we'll be able to load it. I'm going to close this trial, and let's just say then that we've received another trial from another trial list, or maybe it's the same trial list and it's a different study. I'm going to just open this exam number 2. And this is where the time savings comes in, even if you do have quite a few number of trials, because all we really need to do when I open this study is let's go to the study rules. Let's load the rule set. So I will put in my custom rules that I want to be included in the validation. And it just brings in that whole group of all of those rules. And now I just have to hit Tools, Validate, and Log Errors, and ARM will do all the hard work for me of looking into this trial and seeing what has not been filled in, what has not been set the way I want them to be. And in this case, there were no errors. So all of the requirements I have, like the GPS and the variety, that was all filled in. Great. There's just one warning, which shows it's the recommended rule about the GPS accuracy. So again, I set that to be recommended because I don't want to fail validation. It's valid if they don't have the accuracy, although I would like it if they could fill it in. So with that, we know that this trial checks out. They filled in everything the way we want them to, and I can go on to the next one. So the study rule set and using the validation, kind of pairing those two options really can automate this process of looking into all of those sections and making sure that they filled in what you want by just being verbose and creating those study rules, as many of them as you need to be able to really to flesh out those requirements. Actually, I've got a couple of questions here, so I want to make sure not to get too far down the road before we move on to the next option. So here Dan says that he kind of some flexibility for the contractors, asking some fields as recommended during the established phase, and then have another rule to say it's required once the status is final. So that's a great point. So let's use this accuracy for an example, since I already have that recommended when it's established. What Dan is saying is he can do that as recommended. So that way, as soon as the trial is established, it's letting the trialist know that's important to him, but it's not going to be a requirement until the very end. So here now I'm just going to manually add a rule. I could certainly do it with the right click, and you can see it's usually a lot easier if we do, but I'll go to the general trial GPS accuracy. And in this case, I would set it up to be at final. So just as he described here, while the trial is still set to be interim or anything other than final, basically anything before final, then this will just be marked as, sorry, it's number 3 here, be marked as recommended. I wish you'd have it, but we're not going to stop the show. Then once you do mark the trial as final, and I'm guessing this trial is, but let me just double check. So it is marked as final. Now, when I validate, it shows up as an error because the trial is marked as final. Now I need this information. So that's a great recommendation. Thank you, Dan, for that as you build this list. And then a great question here that really segues into my next point with these rules, that building your own rule set is handy. As you can see, we can add the rule set, run the validation, and see what's missing. But certainly you can take that one step further. Does it make sense to add those after you've got the trial already? Wouldn't it be great if the trialist had those rules? And so that's really where you can implement those rules in a protocol. So really the best flow is when you're setting up the protocol, and I'm just creating a blank protocol right now. When you set up the protocol, you should include your rules. And then that way the trialist can run the validation and see all of your requirements, and they can make sure they're filling things in correctly before they send it to you. So here in a protocol, you can load that very rule set that you just created and put that in your protocol, so that way the trials that you're getting back, the trialist had a chance to run your custom validation. Now that's really what you're defining with these rules. So that's a great question, and that's really the best way to do it, is at the protocol level when you're planning and setting things up, put in these rules, so that way when you create the trial, all of these rules would be in the trial, and then that trialist will have access to your custom validation, all of those rules. So before they send you the file, they should run their validation and make sure that they're fitting all of the rules that the sponsor is requiring. So that's really the best route, and really I think it's a good way to start. Really that practical. Right now, I'm in the heat of the moment. I'm working on these trials. What is it I'm always asking for? I'm getting in that mindset will help you to brainstorm and think about what you would need. And it will get by in a pinch if you're still reviewing trials, as we speak at this time of the year. If that's what you're doing, then you can do it on your own. But certainly that next step then is to take that list and put it in your protocol. Another question was specifying measurement units in the study rules. So, most of the study rules are instructions to fill something in at a certain time. So I would say, really, if you want somebody to use a particular unit, just to pick one here, the weather, if we really want them to put in their temperature in a certain unit, I would just, as you create that protocol, choose the unit for them. And then when you send that trial on to them, that unit will be present, and that will be the way to communicate that request. I'd like you to use Fahrenheit, or I'd like you to use Celsius, or the distance here. Please put that in feet. Well, this would be distance to a weather station, so maybe you'd want meters. So that would be what I would recommend as the protocol writer to put in, to actually fill in that field. And there are some cases where filling in the unit might trigger the validation. I know we've pretty recently loosened some of those. Dan, I think you actually kind of helped us to bring some of those to our attention. So hopefully here, if it's not already in the 21.2, in the next update, probably coming next month, hopefully some of those will be relaxed. Because really, when you're in the protocol, it's a lot of that validation should not be there. It doesn't make sense, because the protocol writer should be able to put in a unit and say, this is the unit I want you to use. But in the protocol, you would never document the distance, for example, yet. So yeah, that is just one thing to look out for. Thanks for that too. If you're filling in the unit, sometimes it might yell at you. Another suggestion here I see from Dominique, and I know exactly what you're talking about. Let me just real quick add a study rule here. Let's just say I want the crop variety filled in here for whatever reason. If you change your mind on whether you want it required or recommended, unfortunately right now, I think when I change this to recommended, it clears the row. So that is one thing I've noticed as well. And so I'll make sure to let the programmers know that. I think that is an enhancement that would be useful to be able to switch between the two without losing all of your selections in that row. But yeah, currently, probably the best thing to do would just be to delete the required rule, and then you could go back and add it and make it recommended. That would be how I would recommend doing it for now. Great questions, great suggestions there. Thank you, guys. So to recap here, we kind of covered this all, but again, do the trial walkthrough, open up a trial. It's much more, I think, real and easier to relate to fill in that list. And it's much easier to just right click on what you see and say required, recommended, and add those rules on what you see compared to in a protocol. It's a lot harder to come up with something when you're not looking at it. And then save that list so you can use it in other trials. And then that's all it takes for all of those trials. If you have 20 of them to get through, you can get them done in a half hour. Just a matter of opening the file, loading the set if those rules weren't already in it, and then hit the validate. And you can see what's in the file instead of having to look at every section. Real briefly, just to explain, as you start to load those lists, you can certainly load more than one. And this is maybe more for when you're writing your protocol and wanting to use a bunch of rules in your protocol. If I have a rule set I load, and maybe this is my general one that covers all trials, I could also save a set of rules specific to the fungicide or the insecticide or whatever type of study I'm using. So you can load more than one, and it'll just add on top of this list. So here I have a made up one here about cereals. My research with cereals, I have a couple more fields I need to have. And you can see it just makes this list longer. And actually, when you click into a rule, it will tell you which rule set it came from if you're trying to figure out what's going, where it came from. So the rule sets are additive. You can continue to build on top of them. And I just kind of wanted to show that there is logic in ARM, so you can't load in a rule set later to break a previous rule. So if I was already requiring the GPS and then I load a rule set where it only recommends filling in the GPS, it's not a loophole. You're not going to be able to only recommend it. It's still going to be required. So there's some logic there. Just to be the most stringent rule will win out. There's no way to sneak around a rule or something by adding a contradictory rule. There's a good question here that's related to the permission to edit rule. And right before I address the question, I just want to point out that the best practice is to choose everyone in my company, because this is defining who can change or delete the rule. So if there is a situation, well, in this trial, I can't do this, that's requesting that we do. You can always delete the rule, but you have to be in this permission group, essentially. So I've added this here. So anyone from GDM that has a GDM license, they'll be able to delete that rule if they need be. But if I send this file to somebody else outside my company, they won't be able to delete the rule. And so the question here is, if the study rule is set up for the protocol owners only, so that's really the most stringent. That's just myself, whoever kind of created this protocol, and anyone I put in the settings as another protocol owner. Then somebody else in my company can't necessarily change or delete this rule. So the question is, if the trial owner isn't listed as the protocol owner, do you need to send the trial file to the protocol owner to remove the rule? And so that's exactly right. So as you have this here, if I'm the sponsor who's filled in these rules in my protocol, when I send them to the trialist cannot delete the rules unless I set the permission to anyone. Chances are you probably want everyone in my company. So that way the trialist can still follow your rules. And so then, yes, if there is a situation arises and the trialist says, okay, I have this error, but I can't fix it because XYZ, something happened, then they simply can send the file back to the protocol owner, who can then delete the rule and then update and send the file back. So that's a great question, and the workflow on that. So that is one reason why it's good to put this to everyone in my company. So that way, if I'm out of the office for a week, I'm traveling, and this trialist is having a problem, they could send it to a colleague of mine at GDM, and they would be able to adjust and delete the rule. You don't have to wait for me to get back in the office for the trialist to keep updating their trial. So it's good to keep that permissions a little bit open. All right, I think we covered these tips and tricks already. Real quickly, use the most recent trial. That everything will be fresh for you. If you have several people in your group, in your company, it can be a really great process to all sit down together, or maybe in this day and age, all Zoom in together, and do this process as a group to talk through, so you have multiple voices, multiple experiences to get a wider net of the issues that pop up. Then you can save that set, and it's just a little file on your computer that's really easy to attach to an email and have everyone save it to their own computer, and they can use that set, each person in the group. And then as that question kind of led us to, use this next year and actually be more proactive and put that into all of your protocols so all of the trialists can validate instead. It might be wise to have some of those be recommended to start with, get the researchers kind of used to that, and you can always kind of continue to expand and tweak that list next year. Oh yeah, we had this problem, so next year let's do this a little differently. But it's great to start somewhere, and you can always build next year. It can be a little bit longer list because you add more things to it. That can be a really great approach. So another tool I want to highlight, we'll go kind of quickly through this one, but it is focused on looking at the data. And here in the assessment data editor, depending on the study, you may have a great number of data columns. This one I only have 11. It's pretty short, so it's probably not too hard just to scroll and look at what you have. But depending on how many different pests you encounter and how many different assessments need to be done with each pest, you can get a pretty lengthy list of assessments. And so we have view options, which you can open from the properties panel. There's a button for view options. And so this is for the assessment data header. You'll notice all of the different rows for the description for your assessment we have in this table. And this is where you can toggle them on or off if you want to see some or hide some. But we can also arrange the assessment editor and sort by different fields here. We could even match as well. So just the most basic, the most basic situation in the rating type, I could say I only want to look at my control ratings. So in this match, I just click into the box, click the gold box, and I will view only the control columns. And this changed my view. So now I'm only looking at 6 data columns, and the rest of them were hidden. I'm going to clear that match, but what we can do that might be a little bit quicker to look at all of the columns is apply a sort. So I'm going to put the number 1 in rating unit, in rating type. So I want to sort the data columns by the rating type. And then maybe within the rating type, if I have multiple pests, maybe I want to sort by pest within that. So I'll put a 2. There's also a box here to display the sort as tabs. And this is a really nice way to view the data. And as I click to different tabs, it's only going to show me the data columns where my rating type is test weight or yield. So you can see it's changing the view to match. And this is just auto-populating this list based on my first sort. So I can see all of the control, and then my columns are sorted in a different order because I put that level 2 sort with the pest code. In this case, it looks like I only did 1. Oh, that's not true. I did take 2 assessments for the green foxtail. So 3 and 5 are put next to each other. And then 4 and 6 are together with the black nightshade at the 2 different dates. So this can give you a nice overview that you can kind of click through the different assessments or whatever field matters to you. You can always change this. And actually a shortcut, there's this visible column button that will pop up just that little section of our options. So it's real quick to change and hide things. Maybe I don't need to sort by pest in this case. So I'll remove the 2, but keep the 1. So that way, when I hit apply, then these are sorted in their original order, 1, 2, 3. So that assessment view can be really nice just to get a good snapshot of your columns, you can also save this in your view options. You can save that view and it'll just give it a name, which you can load here in this list. So that way you don't have to manually come in and change those options for every file that you have. All right, the next tool I want to show, I'm just going to close this trial. When you first open ARM without a trial open, or you use the X to close the trial but keep your ARM window open, it loads the study list. And so this is a tool for that question about validating in a batch. We can't run that trial validation in a batch, but this is a tool where you can look at multiple trials at a time and get some information from that. So the study list is a list of all of the trials that you've opened or created, protocols and trials, I should specify. And ARM just compiles a list of a lot of different information from those files into this table here. And the reason we do that is so you can filter. So this top half of the screen is a filter function for all of these different columns of information that are in the trial. So primarily, this tool is designed for searching. It's really great for when someone comes to you and say, you know, what research have we done on, you know, soybeans with this, you know, this product over the last 5 years. It's a really great to use the filtering function to build that type of question, and it will just kind of filter down your list. So trial year, the last 3 years, I can zoom down to those, and it will filter down. So now I'm seeing 13 out of 61 trials were done in the last 3 years. And then I can go to treatment name and, you know, what have we done on Stomper Plus? And so I can just choose that and the list shortens again. So you're narrowing down a search to find files. That's kind of the primary tool for this, but there's some other functionality. Let me remove my filter here because this is really searching across all of the files in this list. So probably the first thing I want to point out is that this is only a view. There's nothing magical about these files, this list here, in that number one, the trials that you saved are just files that live on your computer or live in the cloud, wherever you're saving them. And so this list is not files stored within ARM. We can change this list. And in fact, that's kind of a best practice, is to use this rebuild button, which I should have remembered not to click because I'm on the tutorial list. So it's going to do something a little bit different when I have the tutorial open, and I do this every time I do a training. But when you're in your regular list, when you press the rebuild, then ARM will ask you, what folder should I browse to find all of the trials and protocols that are stored there? And so you can start with a totally fresh list and only view files that are at that one location. So, you know, what I like to recommend if you're wanting to review trials from this year, you know, a lot of people put their different trials in year by year folders. So I'll start with the 2022 folder next year, totally fresh. It's an empty folder. And as we start creating trials and protocols, they'll all go in that folder. And maybe there'll be subfolders in there for each company I'm working with. But I can browse to that 2021 folder, and then, you know, for this year's studies, browse to a 2021 folder, and then have ARM populate the list from that folder. And so it will give us then the list of all of the files that are at that 2021 folder. In my example, I had this tutorial checkbox on, and so ARM has a folder it installs on your computer with tutorial files. So it didn't ask me what folder I wanted to pick. it chose automatically this tutorial folder because I had the tutorial list on. And so it found all of the trials and protocols that are in this folder, and it loaded it in my list. Just real quickly, I'll turn off my tutorial folder and hit the rebuild just to show you when you're in your list with your files, then it will pop open the list. Probably trying to find all of my different folders. It will ask you, what path do you want to load from? Do you want to clear the list or keep the list you have and just add more? Then it will go and find all of those files and populate, just like we saw a moment ago with my tutorial list. So it's just a view. You can rebuild all the time, go find more files, go find fewer files, just depending on what folder you point ARM to. Then you can use some of these fields to get a sense of what is in this list of trials. So, you can use some of these fields for a consistency check. Like if I go into the site description general, I can look at the latitude and longitude. And you can actually see in this table that some of these fields don't have GPS. So this would be one of those ways to kind of get some of that validation of seeing what's not filled in. So I know this, these first 4 or 5 here don't have GPS. So that's going to need to get updated. We can even do that crop and pest, the crop variety. We can do the same thing, what's empty or not, or see a list of just the one particular variety. What trials do I have on that one variety? But when looking at a reviewing, this can be helpful to see that table and what's missing, what should be filled in and isn't. There is even some filters for the assessment data section. Now this one you'll notice, so like the rating type, I can get a list of all of the different rating types in all of the data columns for the trials that are in this list. You'll notice we don't have a column here for the rating type. And that's because there's multiple, you can have more than one column in a trial. So we wouldn't be able to show you just one value. So you can't quite see it in the list, but you could look to say, okay, what studies have control in them? Or maybe I want the reverse to say what studies did not do a control rating. So if I select that option, there's some quick filters here, and I can do an everything except. And this will be the exact opposite filter to say what trials don't have control in them. Well, that's not right. This study should. How come they didn't? We could open this up and, well, maybe they typed in the word control instead of picking from the list, or they didn't fill it in like they should. So there's some options here with these different fields to get a look at the contents of all of the files that you've had currently filtered here in this list. Real briefly, there's also a clipboard button. So you can actually copy the contents of this table. So as you filter things down, it's really handy in that example where somebody's asking you, what have we done? What studies have we done on this, that, and the other in the last 5 years? But all I had to do was paste into Excel, and that whole table filtered on what we saw on the screen is here now in Excel or wherever you would paste it. And you could delete, from here, you could delete columns and trim this down to just the information you need. But it can be a real nice summary tool to see what is going on in your studies. Or if you're a manager and you're not the one actually working in the trials all the time, but you just kind of want to get a snapshot of where we're at as a group, you can go and rebuild your list to the current trial year and get a snapshot of all of the studies and where the group is at with those trials and protocols in that folder. So a lot of functionality there in searching, but also doing a little bit of consistency checks by way of running a filter. All right, I'm running a little low on time. I just want to show real quickly a couple of other features that I won't really demonstrate, but just kind of want to bring to your attention because they're kind of related to the same vein here. First one is the trial location GPS. So there is a button in your trial. If I open up, I'll just grab this trial here. I don't have a screenshot of it, so I will show it. This trial location heading has been turned into a button, which if you press will bring up a satellite map. And it's tied in with Bing Maps, as you can see. I don't have coordinates here, so it's kind of showing probably the most recent coordinates that I grabbed, which is just Brookings here. But it's a great way to visualize the coordinates that have been put in. And so it will draw each of the corners, or if you just put the one corner in, it's a really great way to visualize the coordinates that have been entered. And on this validation thought process, it's a great way to catch if you've put something in wrong. If you accidentally left off the negative sign in the lower right, you'll have this coordinate be way off the screen, and the whole rectangle is drawn in a crazy shape. And it really quickly, immediately can catch that something wasn't entered quite right. And so that feature, this review GPS here, the trial location, is a handy button to press. On the sponsor side, you can actually request or require that the trialist use that tool. So there is a review study rule where you require that trial location GPS be utilized. And so it'll actually require that those GPS coordinates be confirmed. And so when you open that trial, when there's GPS coordinates that have been entered, then when a person opens that trial, this screen will pop up and says it requires that coordinates are reviewed. And so you must sign off to say, yes, those are correct. And then once they're confirmed, then that gets saved, and it's not going to bug you every time you open the file. So feature an ARM to use, and then there's also a corresponding rule where you, as a sponsor, can request or require that the trialist use that. Same thing here, there's a brand new feature for trial signature where you can actually add your signature to a trial and kind of sign off on a trial when it's finished. And so within your profile, you can write on the screen Git and put in your signature and then stamp that signature on a trial. And it shows up here in the trial settings that it's been signed. You kind of tie it into a particular role. So you can have your cooperator sign it. Then you can have the investigator, study director, you can have everyone sign it if you'd like. A nice way to just say, hey, I've reviewed and looked at all of this, everything that's in the trial, and I'm all right with it. So that's just another tool in the same vein of reviewing and looking. There's also kind of a reviewed flag in the settings that's somewhat similar, just doesn't have that signature to it. So we've kind of reached the end of our hour here. I don't want to keep anyone too long, so I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I do have a couple minutes. If you were holding on to a question, feel free to fire that off now, but I don't want to keep anybody hanging. So appreciate the time. Hopefully give that validation and the study rules a try. I think it can save you a lot of time with your trial review. If you have any troubles or further questions, definitely feel free to reach out to us. We want to be a resource for you all. So, like I said, I'll just hang on for another minute. If somebody's typing away in a question, I won't cut you off. But But thanks everybody for joining us today.